Welcome, everyone. We are witnessing history. The New York Knicks are the 2026 NBA champions. For the first time in 53 agonizing, heartbreaking, and chaotic years, the Larry O'Brien Trophy is returning to Madison Square Garden. Let that reality sink in for a moment. The drought is over. The ghosts of 1973 have been laid to rest. Patrick Ewing's missed finger roll, the Charles Smith game, the disastrous Isaiah Thomas era, the brief flicker of hope with Carmelo Anthony, the Phil Jackson experiment, the agonizing lottery luck. It is all officially in the past. The New York Knicks, a franchise that for 2 decades served as the punchline of the NBA, have reached the pinnacle of the basketball world, culminating in a spectacular Game 5 victory over the San Antonio Spurs. Jalen Brunson, the undisputed king of New York, hoisted the Finals MVP trophy after dropping 45 legendary points to close out the series. The confetti rained down, the city erupted, and the narrative around this franchise was permanently rewritten. But as the champagne dries and the parade route down the Canyon of Heroes is finalized, a truly mind-boggling financial reality sits at the core of this championship team. It is a reality that defies every modern convention of professional sports, player empowerment, and ego. It is the secret engine that made this entire miraculous run possible. Jalen Brunson, the Finals MVP, the undisputed leader of the team, the player whose jersey will undoubtedly hang in the rafters of Madison Square Garden one day, is only the 3rd highest-paid player on the Knicks roster. Yes, you heard that correctly. The franchise cornerstone, the man who just brought a title to the biggest media market in the world, makes significantly less money than 2 of his teammates. Karl Anthony Towns and OG Anunoby are operating on contracts that absolutely dwarf the deal signed by Jalen Brunson. And we are not talking about a small discrepancy. We are talking about tens of millions of dollars. To understand how the Knicks built this juggernaut, you have to understand the unprecedented, shocking, and historically significant financial sacrifice made by Jalen Brunson in the summer of 2024. Let us rewind the clock to fully grasp the magnitude of what occurred. In July of 2022, the Knicks signed Jalen Brunson to a 4-year, $104 million contract in free agency. At the time, critics called it an overpay. They said the Knicks were desperate, handing a 9-figure deal to a player who was seen as a solid starting point guard, but not a true superstar, not a primary option on a championship team. Those critics could not have been more wrong. Brunson rapidly developed into an all-NBA offensive engine, completely transforming the culture and the ceiling of the franchise. By the time the summer of 2024 rolled around, Brunson had wildly outperformed that initial contract. He was eligible for a massive contract extension. If he simply waited 1 year to hit unrestricted free agency in the summer of 2025, he could have signed a 5-year maximum contract worth nearly $270 million. That is the going rate for a player of his caliber. That is the generational wealth that players spend their entire lives working toward. Instead, a month before the Knicks executed one of the most aggressive off-season game plans in league history, Jalen Brunson made a deal with himself and with the New York front office. He signed a 4-year, $156.5 million extension. He voluntarily left $113 million of guaranteed money on the table. $113 million. He took a staggering $50 million discount from the 4-year max he could have signed the following summer. In the modern NBA, with a collective bargaining agreement heavily incentivizes stars to take every single available dollar, and where player agents fight tooth and nail to secure maximum value, Brunson's decision was virtually unheard of. He looked at the harsh realities of the new salary cap. He looked at the restrictive second apron penalties designed to break apart expensive teams, and he made a calculated choice to prioritize winning over maximizing his immediate earnings. This brings us to the 2 players who currently boast larger contracts than the Finals MVP. First, there is OG Anunoby. The Knicks acquired Anunoby in a mid-season blockbuster trade during the 2023 to 2024 season. He instantly proved his worth as one of the premier two-way wings in the NBA, providing elite, versatile defense while spacing the floor for Brunson. But Anunoby was entering the final year of his deal, and the Knicks had given up significant assets to acquire him. They had virtually no leverage when it came time to negotiate his new contract. In the summer of 2024, armed with the financial flexibility created by Brunson's massive discount, The Knicks signed OG Anunoby to a 5-year, $212.5 million contract. Then came the true blockbuster, the shockwave that sent ripples across the entire league. The Knicks traded for Karl-Anthony Towns. Towns, a remarkably skilled defensive big man, was operating under a supermax contract extension he signed with the Minnesota Timberwolves, a deal that pays him an average of well over $50 million annually. Acquiring that kind of salary requires immense cap gymnastics and payroll flexibility. It is a financial burden that most teams simply cannot absorb without gutting their depth or triggering catastrophic luxury tax penalties that restrict their ability to make future moves. But the Knicks could do it. They could do it because their best player was making roughly $37 million a season instead of $55 million. They could afford to pay Karl-Anthony Towns his supermax money. They could afford to pay OG Anunoby over $40 million a year. They even had the room to trade for Mikal Bridges, Brunson's former Villanova teammate, and extend him for 4 years and $150 million. They built a starting lineup where essentially every player was acquired via trade or free agency, navigating the most restrictive salary cap environment in NBA history, all because their leader set an impossible standard of unselfishness. Head coach Mike Brown summarized it perfectly after the championship victory over San Antonio. He noted that Brunson took a pay cut that almost no one else in the world would take. He said that Brunson set the bar, and he set the standard for the entire organization. When the best player on the team, the hardest worker in the gym, and the most productive player on the floor is willing to sacrifice over $100 million to build a winner, it eliminates any room for ego from anyone else on the roster. It creates a culture of ultimate accountability and shared purpose. So as we sit here today, marveling at the first New York Knicks championship in over half a century, we are forced to reevaluate how modern NBA dynasties might be built. The contract of these two players, Anunoby and Towns, being significantly larger than Brunson's, is not a sign of a dysfunctional front office or poor cap management. It is, in fact, the exact opposite. It is a defining feature of a masterclass in team building. It is the ultimate testament to a superstar who understood that while the money is incredible, the glory of winning a championship in New York City is truly priceless. We're going to dive incredibly deep into mechanics of these trades, the evolution of the CBA, the history that led us here, and how this roster was meticulously assembled piece by piece. Stay tuned, because the story of how these Knicks were built is unlike anything we've ever seen in the history of professional basketball. To fully comprehend the masterpiece that President of Basketball Operations Leon Rose and his front office have painted, we must first examine the canvas they started with. For almost 3 decades, the New York Knicks were synonymous with dysfunction. They were the cautionary tale of the NBA. Following the Patrick Ewing era, the franchise embarked on a series of misguided attempts to buy a championship, prioritizing flashy names over cohesive roster building. From the Stephon Marbury debacle to the Eddie Curry trade, to the hiring of Phil Jackson, which alienated the fan base and the star players alike, the Knicks were trapped in a cycle of instant gratification that yielded nothing but long-term misery. They constantly traded away valuable first-round draft picks for aging veterans past their prime. They lacked an identity. They lacked patience. And most importantly, they lacked a visionary leader on the court. The shift began subtly at first. The hiring of Leon Rose, a former powerhouse player agent, brought a sense of quiet professionalism to the organization. He stopped the bleeding. He stopped trading away unprotected first-round picks for quick fixes. He began hoarding assets. And then came the turning point, the summer of 2022. The pursuit of Jalen Brunson was aggressive, calculated, and ultimately franchise-altering. The Knicks brought in Brunson's father, Rick Brunson, as an assistant coach. They hired his former agent to the front office. They made it abundantly clear that Jalen was their primary target. When he signed that 4-year, $104 million contract, the NBA investigated and eventually penalized the Knicks for tampering. But frankly, losing a second-round pick was the greatest investment the franchise ever made. When Brunson arrived, he immediately stabilized the point guard position, a gaping black hole for the Knicks for decades. He led them to an unexpected playoff run in his first season. But it was his second season, the 2023 to 2024 campaign, where he elevated from a great player to a legitimate MVP candidate. He proved he could carry an offense single-handedly. However, the front office recognized that while Brunson was spectacular, a team built solely around his isolation scoring would eventually hit a ceiling in the grueling Eastern Conference playoffs. They needed premium wing defenders. They needed secondary creation. They needed elite shooting. This realization triggered the first of three massive, franchise-defining blockbuster trades. The Knicks recognized that the Toronto Raptors were entering a rebuild and coveted R.J. Barrett and Emmanuel Quickley. In exchange, the Knicks acquired OG Anunoby. The impact was instantaneous and terrifying for the rest of the league. With Anunoby on the floor, the Knicks transformed into a defensive juggernaut. He provided the exact archetype of player they desperately needed, a massive, strong, elite perimeter defender capable of guarding the opposing team's best player, from fast point guards to bruising power forwards, while knocking down corner three-pointers at a highly efficient rate. But trading for Anunoby came with a massive financial ticking clock. He possessed a player option for the following season that he was guaranteed to decline. The Knicks traded valuable homegrown talent for what could have theoretically been a half-season rental. When the summer of 2024 arrived, Anunoby held all the cards. The Knicks could not afford to lose him for nothing after trading Quickley and Barrett. Anunoby's representation knew this. Consequently, Anunoby secured a 5-year, $212.5 million contract. It was a staggering sum, making him one of the highest-paid defensive specialists in the history of the sport. Was it an overpay in a vacuum? Perhaps. But in the context of team building, it was an absolute necessity. Now we must introduce the concept of the new NBA collective bargaining agreement, which completely altered the landscape of team building and makes the Knicks' accomplishments so remarkable. The new CBA introduced something called the second apron. This is a salary cap threshold that sits above the luxury tax line. If a team's total payroll crosses the second apron, they face draconian penalties. They lose the taxpayer mid-level exception, meaning they can only sign free agents to veteran minimum contracts. They cannot aggregate salaries in a trade, meaning they cannot package two $10 million players to acquire a $20 million player. They cannot take back more salary in a trade than they send out. They cannot trade their first-round draft pick 7 years into the future, and if they remain in the second apron, that future draft pick automatically drops to the very end of the first round, regardless of their record. The second apron was designed by the league owners to parity-proof the NBA. It was designed to break up expensive teams and prevent rich owners from simply outspending smaller markets. We saw the devastating effect of this on teams like the Phoenix Suns and the Minnesota Timberwolves, who found themselves completely paralyzed financially, unable to improve their rosters around their star players. This is the exact environment where Jalen Brunson's sacrifice shifted from a generous gesture to a franchise-saving strategic maneuver. If Jalen Brunson had demanded his maximum value, if he had waited to sign a contract starting at nearly $50 million a year, the Knicks would have been vaulted deep into the second apron penalty box. Their roster building would have been frozen because Brunson took the massive discount, saving the team over $37 million against the cap over 3 years. He single-handedly kept the Knicks beneath the dreaded second apron. He preserved their ability to make trades. He preserved their mid-level exception. He preserved their ability to aggregate salaries. Armed with this flexibility, Leon Rose executed the next phase of the master plan. The Knicks cashed in the war chest of draft picks they had been hoarding for years. They called up the Brooklyn Nets, their crosstown rivals, and executed a trade that shocked the basketball world. They sent an unprecedented package of unprotected first-round picks to Brooklyn to acquire Mikal Bridges. This move reunited Bridges with his former Villanova College teammates Brunson, Josh Hart, and Dante DiVincenzo. The Nova Knicks were born. Bridges brought elite durability, secondary scoring, and another layer of suffocating perimeter defense. And again, because of the cap space Brunson's discount afforded, the Knicks were able to comfortably extend Bridges on a 4-year, $150 million deal. But the front office was not finished. They looked at the roster and saw elite guard play, overwhelming wing defense, and incredible chemistry. But they also recognized a vulnerability in the front court spacing and a need for a true offensive force who could alleviate the scoring pressure on Brunson. They needed a big man who could pull opposing rim protectors away from the basket, opening up driving lanes for Brunson to operate. This led to the most polarizing and aggressive move of all, the blockbuster trade for Karl-Anthony Towns. The Knicks parted ways with Julius Randle, the player who had helped drag him out of the basement years earlier, along with Dante DiVincenzo, breaking up a piece of the Villanova core. It was an emotionally difficult trade, but a ruthlessly calculated basketball decision. Karl-Anthony Towns is arguably the greatest shooting big man in NBA history. His offensive skill set is entirely unique. However, his contract was a terrifying proposition for most teams. Towns was entering the Supermax extension he signed in Minnesota, a contract that guarantees him well over $220 million and pays him upward of $50 million a season. Under normal circumstances, a team paying their point guard the absolute maximum, while also paying Anunoby $212 million and Bridges $150 million, could never even dream of absorbing a $50 million annual salary like Karl-Anthony Towns. It would be an immediate death sentence under the new CBA rules. But the Knicks were not operating under normal circumstances. They were operating under the Jalen Brunson discount. The integration of Towns was the final piece of the puzzle. His ability to shoot over 40% from beyond the arc as a 7-footer completely warped opposing defenses. When teams tried to trap Jalen Brunson in the pick and roll, Brunson simply passed the ball to Towns, who was either open for a devastating three-pointer or attacking a closeout against a rotating defense. Towns embraced the bright lights of Madison Square Garden. He played with a renewed sense of purpose, understanding that he was brought in to be the offensive co-star on a championship contender. The culmination of these three blockbuster trades, Anunoby, Bridges, and Towns, created a starting lineup with 0 drafted players. It was a team entirely manufactured through astute asset management, aggressive trading, and financial flexibility granted by a selfless superstar. Throughout the regular season, the Knicks were a machine. They overwhelmed teams with their perimeter defense, anchored by Anunoby and Bridges. They battered teams on the glass with the relentless energy of Josh Hart, the ultimate glue guy who was acquired in a brilliant deadline deal the year prior. And offensively, they were orchestrated by the brilliant, methodical, and clutch performances of Jalen Brunson, with Karl-Anthony Towns providing an unstoppable secondary dimension. Then came the 2026 NBA playoffs. The Eastern Conference gauntlet was brutal, but the Knicks possess a level of toughness, a collective defensive identity, and a profound chemistry that could not be broken. They swept through the early rounds with a business-like efficiency. They avenged past demons. They proved that a team built primarily on elite two-way wings and a dominant offensive backcourt could conquer the modern NBA. The NBA Finals matchup against the San Antonio Spurs was a clash of styles and philosophies. The Spurs, featuring their own rising superstars, pushed the Knicks to their absolute limits. But in the crucial moments, the Knicks' experience, their defensive versatility, and the sheer brilliance of Jalen Brunson proved to be too much. Game 4 featured heroic shot-making from OG Anunoby, proving exactly why the front office committed $212 million to him. He locked down the perimeter and hit massive, momentum-shifting three-pointers. Karl-Anthony Towns controlled the paint, rebounding ferociously and scoring with remarkable efficiency, silencing the critics who questioned his massive Supermax contract. And then, Game 5, a legendary performance. Jalen Brunson, the man who sacrificed over $100 million for this exact opportunity, took the floor with a championship in his grasp. He delivered 45 points, navigating through complex defenses, hitting contested mid-range jumpers, and orchestrating the offense with the precision of a maestro. When the final buzzer sounded, securing a 94-90 victory in the championship, the embrace between Brunson, Towns, Anunoby, and Coach Mike Brown told the entire story. It was a validation of a radical strategy. It was proof that in an era defined by player movement, maximum contract, and restrictive salary caps, the ultimate competitive advantage is not just talent, but financial sacrifice. Jalen Brunson essentially bought a championship for the city of New York. He subsidized the contracts of his teammates. He looked at the NBA rules, recognized the mathematical impossibility of keeping a deep, talented roster together while demanding top dollar, and chose the path of champion. The Knicks front office deserves immense credit for executing the vision. Leon Rose did not squander the financial flexibility Brunson provided. He did not hoard the cap space or make marginal upgrades. He recognized the window was open, and he pushed every single chip into the center of the table. He took massive risks. Trading for an injury-prone Anunoby on an expiring contract was a risk. Trading a decade worth of draft capital for Mikal Bridges was a risk. Trading away beloved pieces like Randall and DiVincenzo to take on the massive financial burden of Karl-Anthony Towns was an astronomical risk. But calculated risks are required to win championships. When we analyze how this Knicks team was built, we are analyzing a blueprint that may be impossible for any other franchise to replicate. You cannot simply command your superstar to take a $113 million pay cut. That level of sacrifice must be innate. It requires a player who values legacy over leverage. It requires an environment where the player trusts the front office implicitly to use those savings effectively. The synergy between Jalen Brunson's unselfishness and the Knicks' front office execution is a rare, perhaps once-in-a-lifetime alignment of stars. As we reflect on this historic 2026 NBA championship, the legacy of this New York Knicks team will be studied for decades. They will be remembered for their suffocating defense, the triumphant return of the Villanova chemistry to the biggest stage, and the sheer, unadulterated joy they brought back to Madison Square Garden after 53 years of suffering. But underneath the highlights and the parade confetti, the true defining narrative of this team is the contract structure. The fact that Jalen Brunson, the Finals MVP, is the third highest paid player on his own team will forever stand as one of the most fascinating anomalies in sports history. Karl-Anthony Towns and OG Anunoby earned their massive contracts, and they proved their worth on the biggest stage. They delivered when it mattered most. But those contracts and their very presence on this championship roster exist strictly because Jalen Brunson decided that winning in New York was worth more than a maximum contract. It raises profound questions about the future of the NBA. Will other superstars look at what Brunson accomplished and follow suit? Will we see a new trend of franchise players taking below-market deals to give their front offices the flexibility to navigate the punitive second apron of the new collective bargaining agreement? Or is Brunson a solitary outlier, a player whose unique background and burning desire to win separate him entirely from his peers? What happens next will also be fascinating. Maintaining a championship roster is historically more difficult than building one. The Knicks will eventually have to pay the piper. Brunson will be eligible for another extension in a few years, one that could exceed $400 million. Key rotational players like Landry Shamet and Mitchell Robinson will demand raises. The luxury tax bill will eventually come due. But for now, none of that matters. The gamble paid off in the ultimate currency of the sports world. The New York Knicks are NBA champions. They built a powerhouse roster by exploiting the margins of the salary cap, fueled by an unprecedented financial sacrifice from their best player. It is a story of calculated risks, brilliant trades, and above all, a singular focus on achieving greatness. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the architecture of a champion. The drought is over. The Knicks are back on top of the world.